Hi guys, Daniel here, just recording a quick topic of the week response video, which this week is all about scenarios in Age of Sigmar and I guess in Warhammer in general. I suppose the first point I'd make is that in fantasy, I never ever use scenarios, and I think that's partially because of all the points that Vince made in his original video of about the scenarios they provided didn't really differ enough to make the victory conditions more important than just simply killing your opponent. So, for instance, taking table quarters, if you basically killed most of your opponent's army, you were going to win those victory points. And so it was still really all based on just overwhelming your opponent in a pitch battle, and then just with some additional bonus things on top. The other point I think is important is that I don't think the block formation unit style of the game was really conducive to. The second point I would make is that I don't think the game was conducive to scenarios. I think the block unit style of gameplay with very controlled movement arcs and viewing arcs really limited how much scenarios could be sort of either scattered or spread around the board, because it the limits to movement and line of sight meant that you could potentially have objective points which were almost unreachable for the vast majority of an army, which meant that it could become very skewed, and it could make it very difficult to achieve those objectives. Which I think the objectives need to be easily achievable, and then it's your opponent which provides the difficulty. Whereas I think that, yeah, the limits in movement and the limits provided in the block unit formation would really make some of the sort of scenarios that other games might use just difficult, even if you weren't facing anyone. And I think the dreaded watchtower scenario from the previous edition is a testament to that. It's a fairly reasonable idea of having a unit trying to hold a particular building, but it just didn't work in all that well in the way the game rules worked. So yeah, so I didn't really use scenarios in fantasy ever. Where I do though is I've used the out of the book scenarios in Warhammer 40k, and I think they work really well to even up the game and provide a bit of variation. And I think it's all due to, I think, two things. One, the skirmish nature of the game, and obviously the 360-degree movement meant that if something changed, you could react quite quickly, as opposed to taking a few turns to turn your unit around, and by that time the game's over. So I think that really helps it, and it means that objectives can be more varied because the movement is not a limiting consideration. And I think the other thing is the Maelstrom missions, which are introduced in the latest edition. And for anyone who doesn't know, this is where there's a few objective points and also a series of other random kill objectives or even achievements, things like casting a certain number of spells or shooting a particular kind of unit. And these objectives, you have cards and you draw them each turn, and as soon as you achieve one, you draw another one. And what this means is that the game is constantly in flux, and you don't just simply have one goal throughout the game. It means that you can be playing and you could get a bad couple or a tough couple of objectives, which meant that you could be leading, but those objectives would pull it right back. And so it really chopped and changed, and it meant that you weren't simply charging or shooting at the nearest unit, you were trying to pick out particular things to do. And I think that's the way that scenarios really need to work. One example, a good example of the Maelstrom missions I can provide is with my 40k army Tyranids. I just struggle against my regular opponent under normal kill points because The Tyranids, they're very quite short ranged and very specialized each unit, and I have a tough time dealing with the various I suppose challenges that my opponent can throw up in the ways, particularly in armor. I suppose long range armor destruction in Tyranids is pretty much non-existent. The longest range gun is it's pretty poor by standards, and so playing with these Maelstrom missions means that I don't simply have to try and kill these things that are far away, and that it'll take me a few turns to get there with my combat troops that can deal with it, by which time they can be sort of targeted down and they won't get there. So I also don't simply play the power combination of a bunch of flying hive tyrants. I have a pretty big variation in my army because that's the way I like to play. So these missions provide me alternate objectives, which mean that I can I can achieve victory points while trying to prevent my opponent from doing that, and I think that's where it really works. Moving on to Age of Sigmar, I haven't had many games of it. I think I might have played 5 or 6 games with my, I suppose you'd call it, regular opponent, but we unfortunately don't get to meet up too often. So we haven't played any of the scenarios as such. We've just sort of played pitch battles just to get a grips of the rules, but we're starting to dive into it a bit more now. And so I suppose I can't really put forward my experiences with Age of Sigmar, but I suppose I can put forward my hopes, which is I would really like it to liven the game up in the way the Maelstrom missions do with 40k. So it's not simply charging across the field and trying to decimate the opponent. There's a range of shifting or interesting objectives that mean that the simple kill power of your army is not the deciding factor in the battle. And interestingly enough, I mentioned the missions helped my Tyranid army be competitive in 40k. I think with Age of Sigmar, it's flipped the other way. The armies I play ogres and lizardmen, and my opponent plays Tomb Kings and Wood Elves, which are two armies that seem quite hamstrung in Age of Sigmar when we use simple wounds as a sort of balancing factor. And so that dichotomy is, I think, flipped. I think the moving missions will really help him out and make it a more even game, because I have curb stomped him a couple of times without even trying, and so that's not even for me. It's not that fun when it's an uncompetitive game and it's over by the end of the third turn. All right, so I'll sum up. So yeah, I haven't really used the scenarios in fantasy because I don't think they worked, and I think that 40k is a game that Games Workshop have made where they really do work, and I hope that the scenarios for Age of Sigmar have the same sort of effect in creating a flowing, dynamic, shifting game that isn't simply about killing. I'll leave it there, and till next week, cheers.